In the year 865, the storm of the north descended upon the green fields of England. From the mist-covered seas came not just raiders and swift longships, but an army unlike any the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had ever faced. This was no mere band of plunderers, no quick strike followed by a retreat to the fjords. This was the Great Heathen Army, a vast host of warriors bound together by vengeance, ambition, and the unquenchable hunger for land. Their arrival would forever change the destiny of England. It was here, in the clash between Norse steel and Saxon shield, that kings would rise, kingdoms would fall, and a new political order would be born, the Danelaw. Welcome, travelers of history, to a tale of blood and fire, of faith and fury, of cunning kings and relentless invaders. Today, we journey into one of the most defining chapters of the Viking Age, the wars for England, the struggle of Alfred the Great, and the forging of the Danelaw. If you have ever wondered how the Vikings went from coastal raiders to rulers of half a kingdom, then join me now as we sail back to the 9th century. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England in the mid-9th century were divided, fragile, and vulnerable. Northumbria to the north, Mercia in the center, East Anglia to the east, and Wessex in the south, each a kingdom of proud lords and Christian faith, but often at war with one another. Their unity was weak, their borders contested, and their ability to stand together against an overwhelming foe uncertain at best. For decades, they had endured Viking raids, sudden attacks on monasteries, quick strikes on coastal towns. Lindisfarne, Jarrow, London, Canterbury, all had felt the sting of the Norse sword. Yet these were raids of plunder, not conquest. That was about to change. In 865, a fleet of longships landed in East Anglia. But unlike past raids, this force did not come to loot and leave. The chronicles called it the Missilhere, the Great Army. Allied, according to later tradition, by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. It numbered in the thousands. To the Anglo-Saxons, it was an unimaginable host, larger and more organized than anything they had ever faced. The Great Heathen Army had come not for silver, but for conquest. The East Anglians, recognizing the futility of resistance, chose submission. They offered horses to the Vikings, supplies for their wintering, and for a time, peace was purchased. But the Norsemen did not linger idly. By the following year, the army turned its gaze northward, toward the fractured kingdom of Northumbria. Northumbria was a land in chaos, divided by civil war between rival claimants Osbert and Glesja. The Vikings exploited this weakness with ruthless precision. In 866, they seized the city of York, one of the greatest centers of power and trade in northern England. When Osbert and Glesja joined forces to reclaim their capital, they were met with the ferocity of the Norse. The battle that followed was brutal, and the Anglo-Saxon forces were crushed. Both kings fell, and York remained in Viking hands. It was here, according to legend, that vengeance was exacted. Glesja, said to be the slayer of Ragnar Lothbrok, was captured by the sons of Ragnar. In later sagas, his fate was sealed with the gruesome ritual of the blood eagle, though historians debate whether such a ritual ever truly occurred. Its symbolic power echoes through the story. For the Vikings, vengeance and conquest were one. For Northumbria, it marked the end of its independence. The great kingdom of the north had fallen under the shadow of the Raven banner. With Northumbria subdued, the Great Heathen Army pressed south. In 869, they turned upon East Anglia, the very kingdom that had first sought to appease them. King Edmund, remembered in later centuries as Saint Edmund the Martyr, resisted the invaders. His courage was valiant, but his forces were no match for the Viking host. Captured, he was given the chance to renounce his Christian faith and submit to pagan rule. He refused. For his defiance, the Norse slew him with brutal cruelty, binding him to a tree, scourging him with arrows, and striking him down. His martyrdom would inspire generations of English Christians, but his kingdom was no more. East Anglia was swallowed by the Danelaw. By the early 870s, the Viking conquest was spreading like wildfire. Mercia, the once mighty central kingdom, was harried and weakened. The Danes wintered within its borders, fortifying their strongholds and tightening their grip. One by one, the kingdoms of England bent or broke under the pressure. Only Wessex remained, a bastion of resistance in the south. It was here, in Wessex, that the fate of England would be decided. And it was here that a young king, Alfred, would rise to face the storm. Alfred was not born to rule. In fact, he was the youngest of 5 brothers, the least likely to ascend to the throne of Wessex. Yet fate, and the ferocity of the Viking invasions, placed the crown upon his head in 871, in the midst of England's darkest hour. The chronicles would remember him as Alfred the Great, but greatness was not given. It was forged in fire, in struggle, and in the unyielding determination to defend his people from the storm of the north. When Alfred came to power, the Great Heathen Army was already sweeping across the land. In 871 alone, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records 9 great battles fought between the Danes and the men of Wessex. The blood of warriors soaked the soil of Reading, Ashdown, Basing, and Meryton. Some were victories for the Saxons, others crushing defeats. Yet time and again, Alfred rallied his warriors, refusing to yield. His brother, King Thullard, died in the midst of this desperate struggle, leaving Alfred to inherit not just the throne, but the burden of survival. Alfred's first years as king were a test of endurance. The Vikings were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. They struck swiftly, fortified captured towns, and forced Alfred into uneasy truces that never lasted long. The Anglo-Saxons called them Hahi men, heathens, for they came not just as warriors, but as destroyers of churches, slayers of priests, enemies of Christendom. Yet Alfred, though young, possessed a rare gift, the ability to endure when all seemed lost. In 875, the Vikings divided their forces. One part sailed north to consolidate control over Northumbria, while another pressed deeper into Wessex. Alfred fought, bargained, and resisted. But in 878, disaster struck. The Viking warlord Guthrum, one of the most formidable leaders of the Great Heathen Army, launched a sudden assault in the dead of winter. Striking on the holy night of Twelfth Night, he caught Alfred unprepared. The king barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the marshlands of Somerset with only a handful of loyal followers. His kingdom appeared broken. Wessex, the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon independence, was shattered. To many, it seemed that England had finally fallen, and yet Alfred did not yield. From the swamps and reed beds of Athelney, hidden in the marshes, he built the seed of resistance. Legends tell of the king in exile, disguised as a commoner, even scolded by a peasant woman for burning her cakes while lost in thought. Whether myth or truth, the story reveals the humility of a ruler who endured disgrace yet planned for triumph. From this refuge, Alfred rallied the Fyrd, the local militias of Wessex, and summoned the loyalty of his aldermen. Slowly, the scattered fragments of his kingdom gathered around him. When the moment was right, he struck. The decisive battle came at Edington in 878. Alfred's forces faced Guthrum's army in a clash that would determine the fate of England. Shield wall met shield wall. The thunder of axes and swords echoed across the field, and the future hung in the balance. Against all odds, Alfred's men held firm. The Viking wall buckled. Guthrum's host was broken, routed, and forced to retreat to their stronghold at Chippenham. Alfred pursued, laying siege until the Danes had no choice but to surrender. But Alfred's victory was not merely one of arms. It was also a victory of strategy, of faith, and of diplomacy. Guthrum himself was compelled to accept baptism, taking the Christian name Athelstan, with Alfred standing as his godfather. This was no small gesture. It was a symbolic submission, binding Guthrum not only by treaty, but by faith. The Treaty of Wedmore followed, dividing England into two spheres of influence, Wessex and its allied lands in the south and west, and the vast territory of the Danelaw in the north and east. The Danelaw, its very name derived from the laws of the Danes, was more than just conquered land. It was the beginning of a new cultural and political reality. Towns like York, Leicester, Nottingham, and Lincoln became Viking strongholds, centers of trade and power, where Norse language, law, and custom mingled with Anglo-Saxon tradition. The boundaries of the Danelaw stretched across nearly half of England, a realm within a realm, carved by conquest and sealed by treaty. For the first time, England was not merely under attack, it was divided. Alfred, though triumphant at Edington, knew the struggle was far from over. The Danelaw was not an end, but a fragile balance. For the rest of his reign, he labored to fortify Wessex against future invasions. He built a system of burhs, fortified towns and strongholds linked by roads and garrisons, that created a defensive network across his kingdom. He reorganized the fyrd, ensuring that a portion of the army was always ready while the rest returned to tend the fields. He even expanded the navy, building ships to rival the longships of the Danes, earning him the title Father of the English Navy. But Alfred was not only a warlord. He was a builder, a reformer, and a visionary. He sought to revive learning, commissioning translations of Latin texts into Old English so that his people might not be lost in ignorance. He strengthened law and justice, blending Christian principles with the traditions of the Anglo-Saxons. He believed that survival required not just swords, but wisdom. And so, while the shadow of the Danelaw loomed over the land, Alfred laid the foundations of a stronger England. His struggle with the Great Heathen Army was not merely about survival. It was about transformation. From the ashes of defeat, he forged resilience. From the chaos of invasion, he forged unity. The Treaty of Wedmore and the birth of the Danelaw did not mark the end of Viking power in England, but rather its transformation. What began as waves of raiders had now solidified into a settled force, a political reality. The Danes were no longer simply plunderers, they were rulers. Their presence would shape England's culture, its laws, and its destiny for generations. The Danelaw stretched across the fertile heartlands of northern and eastern England. Its boundaries ran from the River Thames up through Bedford and then north to the River Humber, cutting across the land like a scar. Within this vast region, the towns of York, Lincoln, Leicester, Stamford, and Nottingham formed the 5 boroughs, strongholds of Viking power. These cities became centers not only of military might, but of commerce and governance. From their halls, Norse jarls enforced their customs, their language, and their law. The Danelaw was defined by difference. Where the Saxons followed the codes of their kings and the teachings of their church, the Danes brought their own traditions. Land ownership, inheritance, and justice were conducted by Norse rules. Even centuries later, traces of these Viking laws could be seen in English common law. Place names ending in by Thorpe and Thwaite spread across the countryside, echoes of the Norse settlers who tilled the fields and raised families. The Viking presence was not merely military, it was cultural, permanent, and deeply transformative. Yet for all this, the peace was fragile. Alfred's victory at Edington had forced Guthrum into baptism and submission. But not all Norse warlords were so willing to bend. In the years that followed, new Viking hosts continued to arrive upon English shores. Some sought plunder. Others sought to carve out their own domains. Among them was the warlord Hasting, a cunning and ruthless leader whose campaigns tested Alfred's defenses to their limit. In 892, Hasting led a fleet of longships across the Channel, bringing with him a formidable army. Landing in Kent, he established fortified camps, raiding deep into the land. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records how Alfred and his sons waged a relentless campaign against him, racing from one end of the kingdom to the other to contain his threat. The burh system, which Alfred had so carefully built, now proved its worth. Towns resisted sieges, armies were mustered quickly, and though the battles were hard-fought, the Saxons endured. Hastings' campaign ultimately faltered. The Viking host was harried, divided, and eventually forced to withdraw. But these conflicts revealed a deeper truth. The Viking Age in England was no longer just about raids. It had become a struggle for the soul of the island itself. The Danelaw stood as a rival power, while Wessex, under Alfred and his descendants, became the champion of resistance and renewal. Alfred himself did not live to see the full measure of this struggle. He died in 899, leaving his kingdom to his son Edward, remembered as Edward the Elder. But Alfred's legacy was secure. He had saved Wessex from destruction, preserved a vision of English unity, and laid the groundwork for the reconquest of the Danelaw. His people called him simply England's darling. History would remember him as Alfred the Great. With Alfred's death, the mantle of resistance passed to his heirs. Edward the Elder and his formidable sister, Telfuld, the Lady of the Mercians, carried the struggle forward. Together, they launched campaigns to reclaim the lands lost to the Danelaw. Fort by fort, town by town, they pressed the boundary of Wessex northward, breaking the hold of the Danish Jarls. Their strategy was relentless and effective, using Alfred's system of burhs as staging grounds for conquest. By the early 10th century, the tide was beginning to turn. Mercia, once weakened, rose again under Philip's leadership. Her armies captured Derby and Leicester, striking at the heart of the five boroughs. Edward, too, expanded his power, fortifying towns along the frontier and bringing more territory under West Saxon rule. Slowly, the dream of a united England, first envisioned by Alfred, began to take shape. Yet the Danelaw did not vanish easily. The Norse lords clung fiercely to their territories, and new invasions from across the sea continued to stir unrest. Viking fleets still sailed from Dublin, from Scandinavia, from distant shores, seeking to reclaim lost ground. The struggle between Saxon and Dane was far from over. But something fundamental had changed. England was no longer a collection of fragile, isolated kingdoms. Under Alfred, Edward, and Telfuld, it was becoming a realm with unity, with resilience, with a vision of itself as one people. The age of endless Viking conquest was waning. The age of resistance and recovery had begun. The death of Alfred the Great marked the end of one era, but the struggle for England was far from finished. The Great Heathen Army had fractured, its leaders divided, but the Danelaw remained, a rival power entrenched within the very heart of the land. For decades, it would stand as both a threat and a challenge, a shadow kingdom carved out of Anglo-Saxon soil, governed by Norse lords and warriors who saw themselves not as raiders but as rulers. Edward the Elder inherited his father's burden, and he did so with a fierce determination to continue the work Alfred had begun. His reign, alongside the legendary efforts of his sister Telfuld, Lady of the Mercians, brought a new phase in the war, the reconquest of the Danelaw. Telfuld was no ordinary noblewoman. Married to Thelard, the ruler of Mercia, she became a warrior queen in her own right. When her husband's health failed, she assumed leadership of Mercia, commanding armies, leading sieges, and inspiring her people with a rare blend of piety and steel. Chroniclers would later call her the Lady of the English, for her deeds rivaled those of kings. Together, Edward and Telfuld pressed their campaigns northward. Their strategy was methodical, building new burhs, fortifying key towns, and striking at the Viking strongholds one by one. In 917, Telfuld captured Derby, a major settlement of the five boroughs. The victory was costly. Many of her household warriors fell, but it was a turning point. 2 years later, she seized Leicester, further breaking the Danelaw's hold. Edward, meanwhile, advanced through Essex and East Anglia, tightening the noose. By 918, the great city of York itself seemed ready to yield to Thulfald, but fate intervened. That same year, she died, her work unfinished. Yet her legacy endured, for her daughter was married into Edward's line, uniting Mercia more closely with Wessex. With Thulfald gone, Edward pressed on alone, driving deeper into the lands of the Danes. By the time of his death in 924, much of the Danelaw had been subdued. The dream of a united England was no longer a vision. It was becoming reality. Still, the Norse were not finished. The tides of the North Sea continued to bring new invaders. The 10th century saw the rise of new warlords, fresh fleets, and renewed attempts to shatter the Saxon hold on England. Yet the balance of power had shifted. Wessex was strong, Mercia was loyal, and the burrs of Alfred's design stood firm against siege and storm. Edward's son, Aethelstan, would take the vision further still. In 927, he captured York, bringing Northumbria into his realm. For the first time in history, all the kingdoms of England were united under one crown. Aethelstan was hailed not merely as King of Wessex, but as King of the English. The Danelaw, once the great rival power, had been brought to heel. But though the political Danelaw was broken, the cultural Danelaw endured. The Norse who had settled in England did not vanish. They remained, farming the fields, governing towns, and raising children whose blood was both Saxon and Dane. Their laws, their place names, their traditions blended into the fabric of English life. Even in victory, the Saxons could not erase the Viking imprint. It had become part of England itself. The final decline of the Great Heathen Army was not marked by a single battle, but by a slow transformation. What began in 865 as a vast host of raiders and conquerors ended as generations of settlers, absorbed into the land they once sought to dominate. By the mid-10th century, the Viking threat in England was no longer the overwhelming tide it had once been. The shield walls still clashed, the longships still came, but the dream of a Norse England had faded. Yet the story was not truly over. The 11th century would bring new invasions, new Danish kings, and the rise of figures like Sweyn Forkbeard and Canute the Great, who would once again place England under Scandinavian rule. But those were battles of a later age. For the time of Alfred, Edward, and Thulfald, the struggle with the Great Heathen Army and the Danelaw was both an ending and a beginning, the crucible from which the English nation was forged. The story of the Great Heathen Army and the Danelaw is not merely one of conquest and resistance, but of transformation. The Vikings arrived as raiders, swept across the land as conquerors, and remained as settlers. They reshaped the map of England, but in doing so, they also reshaped its very identity. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, once divided and vulnerable, had been forged by fire into something new. The endless onslaught of the Norse forced them to unify, to innovate, to endure. Alfred the Great's vision of a fortified, educated, and united England laid the foundations for a realm that could withstand not only the Viking storm, but also the tides of history yet to come. His burrs became the backbone of English defense. His translations of sacred texts nurtured a shared culture. His victory at Edington ensured that Wessex would survive, and from that survival, England would be born. The Danelaw itself, though conquered politically, left a legacy that endures to this day. Place names, legal customs, and even words in the English language trace their roots to the Norse settlers who once ruled half the island. Towns like Derby, Grimsby, and Whitby carry their mark. The mingling of Anglo-Saxon and Norse bloodlines created a people more resilient, more diverse, more deeply rooted in the land. The Viking Age in England was not simply an age of war. It was an age of cultural fusion. And yet, in the imagination of the people, the shadow of the Great Heathen Army loomed long. The tales of Ragnar's sons, of Ivar the Boneless and his cunning, of Guthrum's defeat and baptism, of Saint Edmund's martyrdom. These stories lived on in chronicles and in legend, shaping how future generations remembered this age. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a time of trial, of near destruction, and of miraculous survival. For the Norse, it was a saga of bold conquest and lasting influence. By the mid-10th century, the immediate threat of the Great Heathen Army had passed. England stood stronger, more unified than ever before. And yet, the seas remained restless. From the fjords of Norway and the halls of Denmark, new kings still dreamed of the rich fields across the water. The Viking Age in England was not truly over, but it had entered a new chapter. From the storm came a kingdom. From the clash of faiths came a nation. From the fury of the raven banners and the resilience of Alfred's house, the foundations of England were laid. The Great Heathen Army may have sought to destroy the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but instead, it created the conditions for their unification. In this paradox lies the true legacy of the Danelaw. It divided England, but it also gave birth to England. And so ends the tale of the Great Heathen Army and the Danelaw, a saga of conquest and resilience that shaped the destiny of England. If you've sailed with us this far, I invite you to join our shield wall of history lovers. Strike the like button as though it were a Saxon shield. Leave your thoughts in the comments like runes carved upon stone. And subscribe so that you never miss the next chapter of this great saga. The story of the Vikings does not end here. From the shores of Ireland to the halls of Kiev, from the battlefields of Francia to the throne of England itself, their legacy stretches across centuries. Join us next time as we continue our voyage into the world of the Norse, where history and legend walk side by side, and the echoes of the North still thunder across the ages. Until then, keep your sword sharp, your mind sharper, and remember, history is the greatest saga of them all.